Hello, everyone. Welcome to more one live that Get Global is providing. Today, we're going to talk about privacy frameworks. We're going to compare the ISO 27701 and the NIST privacy frameworks. They are two recent privacy framework that were deployed, that were released to public, and we're going to talk about the comparison between both of them. Okay. All right. So my name is Luciano Ferrari, and I am an instructor at Get Global International. And again, today we're going to talk about data privacy and information security, ISO 27701, and the NIST privacy framework. Very good. Okay, so to start, why we need a privacy framework? So why we need a privacy framework? Well, the ISO 27701 and the NIST privacy framework are two guidelines that were both recently released. From one side, we have the ISO 27701 that was released on August 2019. And on the other side, the NIST privacy framework released January 20 this year. So why do we have those kind of new guidelines appearing, right? And seems that more will come. Do we really need a privacy framework? Do you need it? Well, the world is changing, as you know. The internet and information technology is changing the way we do things, the way we communicate, and the way we work, the way we shop, and so on. So with this change, we now have a lot of information that is flowing on the internet or on different systems about us, individuals. And we may not know or understand the consequences of that for our privacy. Besides that, there are also consequences to businesses. An organization may not understand the full impact of those changes to individuals, for the society, for the organization itself. Can it affect the reputation of your business or of your brand, the ability to operate or to grow? So as you can see, this is a very complex environment, and I like to say we are trying to fix things while the train is running. And the train is running very fast, and I can tell you. We are still dealing with some philosophical questions about what is privacy at all, and it may mean different things for different people or for different organizations. Some people are more concerned than others, and to increase the complexity of it, we also have to deal with compliance. So we have to comply with laws, regulations regarding privacy that are also reaching us every day. So my point is that besides the privacy issues that is the main drive for all of this, we also have compliance requirements and fees and fines and lawsuits that we want to avoid, right? We want to keep them away from us. A privacy framework is designed and will help us, will guide on things we need to know and to address to keep the privacy of our employees, customers, stakeholders, etc. Following them also help us to be compliant. It help us. I didn't say it make us compliant. So obviously each law or regulation have their own particularity, but a privacy guideline tries to go beyond that border, beyond any particular law or regulation, and provide us resources that we need to cover in order to protect the privacy, no matter what regulation we have to face. Following a privacy framework don't make you compliant. If anyone tells you differently, just don't believe that, ignore it. But it helps you, right? That of course, it helps you through the process. It's better and easier with a privacy framework rather than without one. That's really a fact. Now, which one you have, you may choose. So this should be your decision, right? If you want to go to use these or that framework, so that's something that you're going to have to decide by yourself. I'm going to provide you information about the most prominent ones, and I hope that this may help you to pick your own choice. But we're going to get back to this discussion at the end of the presentation. So we don't have much time, so the idea is to give you a crash course about each of those two frameworks without going too deeper, okay? All right, so let's move on and talk about, let's start with the NIST privacy. So NIST, that's the name of it. NIST privacy framework, okay? All right, that's okay. The NIST privacy framework, okay, that's some, there's a value of proposition. I'll put it up here for you. Value, stop using this, value propositions, okay, that it has. And the value proposition is based on three elements, and it's considered the heart of what the framework is about, right? Its purpose. It supports organizations in building customer trust. So the first one is building customer trust. Okay, by supporting, how it does that, it is by supporting that ethical decision making in product and service design or deployment that optimizes those beneficial uses of data while minimizing the adverse consequences for individuals, privacy, and society as a whole. The risk-based nature of the privacy framework and carrying out privacy risk assessments can help organizations to find that sweet spot between optimizing those beneficial uses of data and mitigating those adverse consequences for individuals. Okay? All right, so let's go now with the second. I'll put the second one here, right here. All right. So second, the framework can help organizations in fulfilling their current compliance obligations, as well as future-proofing products and services to meet these obligations in a changing technological and policy environment. So the NIST privacy framework is designed to be, again, agnostic to any particular law or regulation, but instead to provide the building blocks, the key outcomes and activities that organizations can use and then map back to their compliance obligations. This way, organizations can demonstrate which outcome and activities they are undertaking to meet those obligations specifically, and actually demonstrate all of the activities to, for instance, regulators, to demonstrate that traceability from their activities to their legal or regulatory obligations. So this helps a lot, right? It also supports, and the third value proposition here is facilitating communication. So it also supports facilitating communication about privacy practices with customers, whether that is individual customers, business customers, or your assessors and regulators. The broad shifting nature of privacy has made it difficult to communicate clearly about privacy risks within and between organizations and with individuals. But the framework is intended to fill that gap by providing a common language for talking about privacy risk. The framework can be useful in communicating with, for example, your regulators, going back to the compliance point earlier, to show which activities you are undertaking to support legal compliance. And it can also be useful in communicating across your organization different roles from the legal folks to your IT professionals about privacy to support better privacy risk management. Okay, that's good. So let's move on. Let me just have this out, and I'll put here now data privacy and information security. Okay, I want to talk about this cyber. So let's put the cyber security risks and privacy risks. They're two different things. Okay, let's talk about that. Okay, so having a general understanding of the different origins of cybersecurity and privacy risk is important for determining the most effective solution for addressing those risks. NIST illustrates this different origins of risk using a Venn diagram that I cannot put here in a text box, but it's those different circles that they intercept together, right? So there seems to be two different circles, but when they are together, there is some layer of intersection between those circles, and that's what I want to talk about. Okay, to convey the relationship between cybersecurity risks and privacy risks. So cybersecurity risks, they are commonly understood to arise from the loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, right? And managing cybersecurity risk, of course, contributes to manage privacy risks, okay? But it's not sufficient on its own, as privacy risks can also arise by means unrelated to the cybersecurity incidents. And the overlap of cybersecurity and privacy risks comes in when we talk about those data breaches. But we also know that privacy risks extend beyond that. The NIST privacy framework approach to privacy risk is to consider privacy events of potential problems that individuals could experience arising from system product or service operations with data, whether that's in the digital or non-digital form, through the complete life cycle from data collection through its disposal, which is carried out by organizations to meet their mission or business objectives. The data operations are described in the framework in the singular as data action and collectively as data processing. So these problems that individuals, whether singly or in groups, can experience as a result of data processing can be expressed in various ways. And this describes these problems are ranging from dignity type effects such as embarrassment to more tangible harm such as discrimination or economic loss. So in the NIST privacy framework, for example, when we talk about privacy risks, we are talking about the likelihood that individuals will experience problems that result from data processing and the impact should those problems occur. They use likelihood and impact language that mirrors the cybersecurity risk management space, but on the privacy framework, they focus on the problems that individuals could experience instead of threats and vulnerabilities. You see the difference? A good example of this, other aspects of privacy risks, come in when we think about the smart meters. So some communities rejected the use of smart meters, and this is not because they were concerned that utility companies were not going to keep their data secure. They were instead concerned about the amount of granular information that was being collected about their electric use within their privacy spaces in their homes and what kind of profiling could occur as a result of that, having that granular data. So people felt surveilled, and this wasn't a cybersecurity problem, it was a privacy problem. And in that, there was a problem arising from the processing of data that an organization was doing simply for their mission business objectives. In fact, for a beneficial objective to provide more efficient energy usage. But it still gave rise to privacy risks as a result. So that's what this framework is really intended to help with, to help organizations with those beneficial use of data while minimizing the adverse consequences for individuals. So as you see in this, as you imagine the Venn diagram here between the cyber security risks and privacy risks here, there are these two, and there's an intersection between these two. The intersection are the cybersecurity risks related to privacy. That's the intersection, what means. And that's where the privacy framework try to focus on. So the focus does not try to focus all the different aspects of privacy itself, but the intersection of problems between cybersecurity risks and privacy risks. That's important for you to understand. One good example is about smart meters again, right? That I just talked about that. All right, that's good. So let's move on. Let's see. Let's go a little deeper now with this NIST privacy. I'm going to try to expose you some of the things here that it contains. So let me erase this now. So let's talk about the key privacy risk management practice. Okay, so I'll type then out here and then I'll discuss them. Okay, so the first one is organizing preparatory resources. Then you have determining privacy capabilities. Let's see, defining privacy requirements. Then you have conducting privacy risk assessments. I'll put it together, make more sense. Okay, then creating privacy, and we're going all over that. Okay, requirements, traceability, and monitoring changing privacy risks. Okay, so keep all those key management practices, and we go over them. All right, so while the NIST privacy framework itself isn't necessarily the place that they can provide really detailed guidance on privacy risk management, they also know that privacy risk management is less mature as a discipline than the cybersecurity risk management, right? This is something new, right? We're still dealing with that, okay? So for that reason, it's interesting that in the framework, it needs to spend a bit more time providing risk management guidance than they may have done in the cybersecurity framework, and that's very helpful, right? Needs to build out this privacy risk management guidance where they've highlighted some key privacy risk management practices to better support organizations that might be looking for a bit of additional guidance when it comes to privacy risk management. So without going into extreme detail on any of this, NIST highlighted a couple of key practices that you can find it on Appendix D of the framework, such as organization preparatory resources. That session covers risk management role assignments, and they highlight that having a diverse workforce in this process is really useful to bringing in different perspectives, right? When you are analyzing for privacy risk and getting to better responses. So we are also determining your organizational level privacy requirements, which often flows out of the many legal requirements that organizations are facing today, and also identifying system, product, or service design artifacts. This might mean that you are going to talk to your IT folks to put architecture diagrams from systems so that you can do a better job and have a starting point when you are getting to your data inventory and mapping processes. There may be some existing artifacts out there that you can pull from to better support your activities and doing a better privacy risk assessments. All right? Okay, so let's move on. So what is next? So let's talk about the privacy framework that NIST, obviously, right? Structure. Okay, so it has some structures, and we're gonna talk about core. So key structure. So core, then you have profiles and implementation tiers. So if you're familiar with NIST, you probably heard about this and you probably know what they mean, okay? All right. So let's talk about this structure and on the way you can use it. There are three elements that make up the framework. So NIST decided to align the privacy framework with the NIST cybersecurity framework. So if you are familiar with the NIST cybersecurity framework, you've noticed that they follow the exactly same model of having the core, the profiles, and implementation tiers, and they essentially just adapt them to the privacy space. So with the core, they are really just providing an increasingly granular set of activities and outcomes that enable an organization dialogue about managing privacy risk. The profiles, like the cybersecurity framework, are just essentially a selection of specific functions, categories, and subcategories from the core that the organization has prioritized to help them manage privacy risk. And then the implementation tiers really can help an organization communicate further about whether it has sufficient processes and resources in place to manage privacy risk and achieve its target profile. So let's now go ahead and dig into those in a little bit more detail. And for that, so let me erase these and talk about NIST privacy framework core. Okay, let me see what I can put here for you. So there are functions, and then I'll put a couple of things here. Identify P, and I'll explain what that means later. Govern P. I'll put something else called communicate P. Protect. That's how they put this together. And then we also have categories and subcategories. Okay, so let's go over it. So starting out with the core. Okay, structurally, this is how the framework creates increasingly granular dialogue. So it begins with functions, right here. Okay, which really organize the foundational privacy activities at their highest level. And being 5 simple words: identify, govern, control, communicate, protect, all with the -P for privacy. Okay, they can be used to have a dialogue with senior management or a board that are not necessarily experts in privacy. So this is what NIST found with the cybersecurity framework, and they really wanted to try to achieve that communication goal for the framework as well. And so I will say that although this, kind of a graphic here, right, is obviously not even two-dimensional, right? So you have to use your imagination to try to think about that, because the idea, the functions, they are not intended to be hierarchical. Rather, they should be performed concurrently or continuously to really form or enhance an operational culture that addresses the dynamic nature of privacy risk. With that said, this is recognition that identify and govern provide foundation to say cover organizational level activities, but there is really no order of importance between the two. So we can think of it like walking and chewing gum at the same time, right? Categories are just essentially subdivisions of a function that we are just essentially divided into groups of privacy outcomes that are closely tied to programmatic needs and particular activities. And subcategories clearly further divide a category into specific outcomes of technical or management activities. They are the building blocks for the policies and the capabilities that enable different parts of the organization, such as legal, compliance, engineering, to really collaborate at the implementation level. Okay, so that's what it is about. All right, moving on. Let's go back to that the diagram that you talked in the past. So let's put here cyber security. Framework alignment. Okay. So again, cyber security risks and privacy risks. Okay. Okay, so let's go back to this. Remember that this the Venn diagram, there are two circles, and there is an intersection between those two circles, and that intersection is what the framework focus on, the interface between cybersecurity risks and privacy risks. Okay, so let's go back to this, but now with a small different perspective about cybersecurity framework alignment. So I would say that how to manage alignment with the cybersecurity framework is going to be an ongoing conversation. So NIST encourages a strong collaboration between privacy and cybersecurity. So this diagram explains the relationship between cybersecurity and privacy risks, and NIST essentially overlaid the functions from both frameworks to show how the functions can be used to manage different aspects of risk. So if you are an organization that's just starting out with privacy or don't have a strong collaboration with cybersecurity and need a way to talk to them about things like privacy breaches, you can use a common language that just have a little bit more of a lens of privacy to it. Okay, that's good. All right, so now let's move on to the profiles. So let's talk about NIST privacy profiles. So basically, how can I go into short here? So we have the core, right? And then from the core, what we want to do is this. So we have our current list of cores, right? So if you under this current, we have a list of things that we are trying to do here. Okay, let's say that we have like 1, 2, 3, 4 items, and then we want to move from current to kind of target. So that's our target, and on the target itself, actually, I don't want to have only 4. I want to have like 1, 2, 3. You got the idea, right? I want to keep my current 4 here that I have, but I also want to add a couple more, maybe more of these 3 here. this, and this. I don't know, something like this, right? So from the core, we have what we are covering today and the target. So what I want to cover as a target. All right. So again, so profiles are simply a selection of specific functions, categories, and subcategories from the core that an organization has prioritized to help it manage privacy risk. So this is really the heart of the flexible risk-based approach of the privacy framework. The core is not a checklist. An organization may not need to achieve every outcome, right? That's really important, or activity that is reflected in the core, but the current profile simply reflects the current state of an organization's activity, but if this is not sufficient, right, taking into account things like the organization's goals, your role or roles in the data processing ecosystem, or industry sector or legal regulatory requirements, industry best practices, risk management priorities, and of course the privacy needs of individuals, then an organization can use a target to profile, to select and prioritize those functions, categories, and subcategories that best meet its specific needs, right? So it's also important to recognize in the developing profiles that it's not obligatory to achieve an outcome in its entirety. You can use profiles to express partial achievements of an outcome, as it's not all aspects of an outcome may be relevant for managing your privacy risk, or you may use a target profile to express in an aspects of an outcome that you don't currently have the capability to achieve, but you do in fact want to achieve in the future. Another point that you may need to select multiple outcomes in combination with to appropriately manage privacy risk. So for example, if your organization needs to respond to individual requests for data access, right, then you may be selecting corresponding multiple subcategories, and data elements can be accessed for review as well as outcomes in the category on identities management, authentication, and access control, because you are gonna want to ensure that only individuals to whom the data pertains gets access to it. Okay. All right. So moving on, we're going now to the what they call implementation tiers. Okay. Implementation tiers. We have a couple things, so let's try to do something here. So first, let me remove this. Understanding privacy risks, right? Then you have the resources and processes, and then we move to different things like implementation tiers. That could be like one partial, two risk informed, repeatable, and adaptive. Okay, so let me explain you this. So this is the last, right, of the process from NIST, the implementation tiers. They really provide a point of reference on how an organization views privacy risks and whether it has sufficient processes and resources in place to manage that risk. So essentially, you were asking now that you sort of understand the privacy risks that you need to manage. The question is, do you have sufficient resources and processes in place to manage those risks? So the tiers really reflect an organization's progression from sort of informal reactive responses to approaches that are agile and risk informed. Within each tier, therefore, elements privacy risk management processes, integrated privacy risk management programs, data processing, ecosystem, relationships, and workforce. And these can all be assessed independently from each other, and you should take a look at the Appendix A in the framework for the definitions. So how to use the implementation tiers? So the best answer for that is that you can use it in whatever way it works best for you. Okay, that's not a good answer, right? But that's true. So some organizations prefer to score them against the subcategories in the core. So for example, they may assign like a 1 to 4 number for each of the 4 elements for each subcategory in their current and target profile. And this can help them determine whether there are any additional efforts or resources needed to achieve that subcategory. On the other hand, other organizations just assign a 1 to 4 number for each of the elements as the kind of holistic benchmark of where the organization is currently and where they want to be. So for example, perhaps the organization considers its workforce currently at 2, but believes that it needs to be at 4. And so this could help drive budget discussions as well as hiring plans and a training curriculum. And certainly organizations can and have created additional tiers or elements as needed. So organizations at tier 1 will likely benefit from moving to tier 2, but not all organizations need to achieve tiers 3 or 4. It really depends on whether an organization processes or resources at its current tier are sufficient to help it manage its privacy risks. Okay? So the successful implementation of the NIST privacy framework is really based upon achieving the outcome described in your target profiles, and really does not depend upon your determination about the tiers. Okay. So let's go on a little bit more detail now. This will be the last the portion that you're going to talk about the NIST privacy framework, and then you're going to move to the ISO. So let's talk about this NIST privacy framework core. Okay. So let's take a look on the core. So I suggest you to go to the NIST and download the program, download the core, so you can check it by yourself. But first of all, you might have noticed that the NIST privacy framework functions are all they all have this -P identifier to them that I mentioned to you, and that's simply to distinguish them from any of their counterparts over the cybersecurity framework, as some of the functions appear in both. But here, right, in the privacy framework, they may appear with a bit more of that privacy lens applied to them. So second, in the core, you might also note that there is a shading on the right? So if you download it, there will be some items that will have some kind of a shading to the right of any given function, category, or subcategories. And also there are some strips of shading that indicates whether the content is either identical to or it has been adapted from language that exists in the cybersecurity framework. So the darker shadings indicates identical language, whereas the lighter shadings indicates that it's been adapted and has a bit of the privacy lens applied to it. So that's kind of a useful information when you download it and see it, so you don't have to, why we have this different color. So I'm providing you some information as when you download it, you know why those different shadings means. Okay. So the first NIST privacy framework function is identify-P. So I'll put that here. So it's identify identify-p. So that's the first one. If you download it, the first thing you're going to find is this, okay, which is intended at a high level to help establish those organizational levels, foundational privacy or general risk management activities to help you better understand and manage privacy risk. Identify is, of course, a function in the cybersecurity framework, and in many ways, identify-p is very similar to how it appears in the cybersecurity framework. So since these are simply good organizational level processes, but in identify-p, you see much more focus, much more of the privacy focus. Okay. The first category that you're going to see here is the inventory and mapping. So that's the first category. Okay. This category is different from the cybersecurity framework because inventory data mapping it is so critical to privacy risk management processes as well as meeting any legal obligations in the privacy space. So looking at some of the subcategories in inventory and mapping, obviously it is important to first understand which systems, products, or services are really processing the data. And it's useful then to dive deeper on that, knowing the owners or operators of those systems that are processing the data. Is a third party operating a given component or everything internal to your organization and how? So these might be indicators of different levels of privacy risks. Then it can come to categories of individuals whose data is being processed. So sometimes organizations have found it helpful to create different profiles for different categories of individuals. So for example, it might be one profile for an organization's customers and one for their employees. So these might be different privacy risks or legal obligations when it comes to these different categories of individuals or different demographics. So this could be a useful tool in understanding those different content. Further, what are the specific operators or operations that systems, products, services are taking with the data? So these operations can make a big difference. Is the service collecting data, analyzing it, and then sharing it externally? Are you disposing it at any point? So maybe it's all of the above, right? But either way, these are really key inputs to your privacy risk management and how you respond to your risk. The purposes for processing the data are also key. Purposes help in understanding the context in which, for instance, the data was originally collected and what uses of the data might be authorized versus unauthorized based on the purpose for collection. So it's so important in privacy risk assessments to understand your context, which in turn helps you to identify the pertinent legal requirements and what potential adverse consequences for individuals could occur relating to that data processing. Another aspect of that content is the data processing environment. Is the data being processed in the cloud or it has been processed locally on devices? These are just more inputs to your consideration as you think about the context of your data processing activities. So you don't want to, again, I don't want to extend too much more of this, but I hope you got a very nice flavor and what is the NIST privacy framework, what it is about. Okay, so let's move on now. Okay, so let me remove this now and let's talk about the ISO IEC 27701. All right, let's move to this. So, how this started, okay? So there are some relationships here that I'd like to cover with you here. So let's go about, so the ISO 27701 is part of the ISO, I put here, 27,000 family, okay? So there is a whole big ISO 27,000 family, and it mainly maps, it is a direct extension of the ISO 27001 and 27002. All right. ISO have a privacy framework, okay, a specific privacy framework, and that's a different one. That's the ISO IEC 29100. Okay. The ISO 27701 specifies requirements and provides guidance for establishing, implementing, maintaining, and continually improving a privacy information management system, what they call PIMS, right? Privacy Information Management System. I'll put it here. PIMS. Privacy. Oops. Not privacy. Privacy Information Management System. Okay. PIMS. That's what they call. In the form of an extension to the ISO 27001 and 27002 for privacy management with the context of the organization. So it specifies PIMS related requirements and provides guidance for PII controllers and PII processors holding responsibility and accountability for PII processing. Okay, makes sense? So the ISO 27701 is applicable to all types and sizes of organizations as well as like the NIST, including public and private companies, government entities, and not-for-profit organizations, which are PII controllers and or PII processors, processing PII within an ISMS, Information System Management. Okay. All right. There are some relationship in maps with this. So put here relationships and maps. So requirements and guidance for PII protection vary depending on the context of the organization, in particular when national legislation and or regulation exists. So the ISO 27001 requires that this context be understood and taken into account. The ISO 27701 includes mapping to the privacy framework and principles defined in different other ones. So I'll put it here. So ISO 27701 maps, for example, the ISO IEC 29100, that is the privacy framework, but also the ISO IEC 27018, the ISO IEC 29151, and also the GDPR, the famous GDPR. Okay. However, this can need to be interpreted to take into account local legislation and or regulation. The ISO 27701 can be used by PII controllers, right, including those that are joint PII controllers in PII processors, including those using subcontracted PII processors, and those processing PII as subcontractors to PII processors. An organization complying with the requirements in the 27701 will generate documentary evidence of how it handles the processing of PII. So put it out here. So it will do. It will provide some kind of a. So who supports this? ISO 27701 will generate. Documentary evidence. Okay. on how to handle the processing of PII. Okay. Such evidences can be used to facilitate agreements with business partners where the processing of the PII is mutually relevant. This can also assist in relationships with other stakeholders. The use of this document in conjunction with the ISO 27001 can, if desired, provide independent verification of this evidence. For those who are not familiar with ISO 27701, was initially developed as the ISO IEC 27552, right? But then not anymore, okay? Now it becomes the ISO 27701. And the ISO 27701 applies the framework developed by ISO to improve alignment among its management system standards. And it enables an organization to align or integrate its PIMS with the requirements of other management system standards. Okay? Good. So let's move on. Let's talk about the structure now. So ISO 27701 structure. Okay? So it has some structures. The structure is so this is how if you purchase the 27701, that's the structure that you're going to have if you find it. So first of all is the PIMS specific requirements related to ISO 27001, right? So it talks about, the first section of it talks about specific requirements related to the ISO 27001. And then it talks about the PIMS, specific guidance related to ISO 27002. Why guidance and requirements? Remember that the 27001 is a standard. It is all of that is listed there is a requirement, the thing that must be happening. The ISO 27002 is just a guide, right? It's not obligatory. You have to put all the controls, but it's just to help and support and to be compliant with the 27001. So also here with the 27701, there is a reference to the 27002, but as a guidance, not as a requirement. And then there is also some additional ISO 27002 guidance again, but specifically for PII controllers. And then it also provides additional ISO 27002 guidance again. Oops. But for PII processors. And then it comes with a lot of different appendix. It has that is very helpful actually. Appendix A, B, C, D, E, and F. So that's the structure of the ISO 27001. Okay, so the requirements of the ISO 27001 mentioning information security shall be extended to the protection of privacy as potentially affected by the processing of PII. Okay, so that's what they talk about. The guidance in ISO 27002 mentioning information security should also be extended, right, to the protection of privacy as potentially affected by the processing of PII. So every time you see information security is used in the 27002, you have to replace it to information security and privacy. So that's what is the approach that ISO suggests. So all the controls, objectives, and controls should be considered in the context of both risks to information security as well as risks to privacy related to the processing of PII. unless otherwise stated by specific provisions or determined by the organization according to the applicable jurisdictions. The same guidance apply for PII controllers and PII processors. So the guidance in clause 6, right, and the additions in the clause create the PIMS, the specific guidance for PII controllers. And the implementation guidance documented in this clause relates to the controls listed in the Annex A. There are some conditions for collecting and processing. The objective is to determine and document the processing is lawful within legal basis as per applicable jurisdictions and with clearly defined and legitimate purposes. It identifies and documents purpose. And the control is this. So the organization should identify and document the specific purpose or purposes for which the PII would be processed. Implementation guidance. The organization should ensure that PII principals understand the purpose for which their PII is processed. It is the responsibility of the organization to clearly document and communicate to the PII principals. Without a clear statement of the purpose for the processing, consent and choice cannot be adequately given. So documentation of the purposes for processing should be sufficiently clear and detailed to be usable and the required information to be provided to PII principals. And we have a lot of places in the standard that we can find all of that information for you. Now about processors. So there is remember that there is a guidance in the clause 6, and the additions of this clause create the PIMS specific guidance for PII processors. So the implementation guidance documented in this clause, right, to the controls is listed in Appendix B, right? So Appendix A, right, is for controllers, and Appendix B is for the processors. There are also some conditions for collection and processing, similar to that. There are the objectives to determine and document that processing is lawful with legal basis and applicable the same way. There are some customer agreements, and the control is that the organization should ensure, where relevant, that the contract to PII to process PII addresses the organization's role in providing assistance with the customer's obligations, right? Taking into account the nature of processing and the information available to the organization. So how to implement that? Where's the implementation guide? The contract between organization and the customer should include the following whenever relevant, and depending on the customer's role, PII controller or PII processor. This list is neither definitive nor exhaustive, but privacy by design and privacy by default. Achieving security of processing, notification of breaches involving PII to a supervisory authority, notification of breaches involving PII to customers and PII principals, conducting privacy impact assessments, the PIA, and the assurance of assistance by the PII processor if prior consultations with relevant PII protection. Authorities are needed. Some jurisdictions requires that the contract include the subject matter and duration of the processing, the nature and purpose of the processing, and the type of PII in categories of PII principles. It also covers the organization purpose controls. So the organization should ensure that PII processed on behalf of a customer are only processed for the purpose expressed in the documented instructions of the customer. And the guidance for implementation is that the contract between the organization and the customer should include, but again, not limited to the objective and time frame to be achieved by the service. In order to achieve the customer's purpose, there can be technical reasons why it is appropriate for the organization to determine the method for processing PII consistent with the general instructions of the customer, but without the customer's express instructions. So for example, in order to efficiently utilize network or processing capacity, it can be necessary to allocate specific processing resources depending on certain characteristics of the PII principle. The organization should allow the customer to verify their compliance with the purpose, specification, and limitation principles. This also ensures that no PII is processed by the organization or any of its subcontractors also for other purposes than those expressed in the documented instructions of the customer. This is really important. Okay, and then there are those different appendix that I mentioned to you. So the first one is Appendix A, is a normative, right? It is not a requirement; it is normative. The PIMS specific reference control objectives and controls for PII controllers. So this annex is for use by organizations acting as PII controllers with or without the use of PII processors. It extends the ISO 27001 Annex A and the additional or modified control objectives and controls listed in the table, A1 in that case, are directly derived from and aligned with those defined in this document and are to be used in context with the ISO 27001. Okay, so not all the controls objectives and controls listed on the Annex A need to be included in the PIMS implementation. A justification, though, for excluding any control objectives shall be included in the statement of applicability. And the justification of exclusion can include where the controls are not deemed necessary by the risk assessment and where they are not required by or are subject to exceptions under the applicable legislation and or regulation. Okay, then we have the Appendix B. It is also a normative, but it focuses more on the processors. The Annex B is for use by organizations acting as PII processors with or without the use of PII subcontractors, and it extends the ISO 27001 Annex B. Okay, so the Annex A, sorry. The additional or modified control objectives and control lists, they are directly derived from and aligned with those defined in this document and are to be used in context with ISO 27001. So now again, the controls objectives and controls listed, they have to be included, and yeah, the same thing as before, right? So everything that is not there should be justified, right? Exactly as I mentioned for the Appendix A. Okay. Then you have Appendix C. There's more also another informative, right? So the other two are normative. They are required, right? If you are a processor or if you are a controller, depending on your role. But Appendix C is more informative. It is not normative like the previous one. So it gives an indicative mapping between provisions of this document and the privacy principles from the ISO 29100. So it shows in a purely indicative manner how compliance to requirements and controls of this document relates to the general privacy principles specified in the ISO 29100. That's it. Appendix D is also informative, not normative, as Appendix A and B. So it's just informative, and it's the mapping to the GDPR. So this annex gives an indicative mapping between provisions of this document in Articles 5 to 49, except the 43 of the General Data Protection Regulation of the European Union, and it shows how compliance to the requirements and controls of this document for the ISO 27701 can be relevant to fulfill obligations of the GDPR. So, however, it is purely indicative, and as per this document, it is the organization's responsibility to assess its legal obligations and decide how to comply with them. It's very important. And you have Appendix E, informative, also not normative, and it's a mapping to ISO 27018 and 29151. So it gives further mappings information for you, okay? And again, it's purely indicative and should not be assumed that a given link between provisions means equivalence. Then it has the Appendix F, the last one, how to apply ISO 27701 to ISO 27001 and ISO 27002. So this document is based on the ISO 27001 and 27002 and extends its requirements and guidance to take into account, in addition to information security, the protection of privacy of PII, PII principles as potentially affected by the processing of PII. So that means where the term information security is used in ISO 27001 or 27002, information security and privacy applies instead. And the table gives the mapping of the extensions of the terms information security in order to apply to this document. So basically there are 3 cases for applying this document to protection of privacy of PII principles. When processing PII, 1, the application of security standards as is, the reference standards applies as it is with the extensions or terms as listed above. Therefore, the reference standard is not repeated, but only referred to in respective clauses. 2, additions to security standards. The reference standards applies with additional privacy-specific requirements or implementation guidance. And 3, a refinement of security standards. So the reference standards are refined by privacy-specific requirements or implementation guidance. Very well. So some examples here, right? Then you have an example here of the ISO 27701. There is, for example, this clause. I'll just write it down here for you. The clause 5.4.1.2. That is information security risk assessment. So the requirement. So what it states. So the requirements stated in ISO 27001 applies with the following refinements. So it references to the ISO 27001 and then it provides some refined statements. Like, for example, the organization shall apply the information security risk assessment processes to identify risks associated with the laws of confidentiality, integrity, and availability within the scope of PIMS. So that's the additional they put. The organization shall apply privacy risk assessment processes to identify risks related to the processing of PII within the scope of the PIMS. The organization shall ensure throughout the risk assessment processes that the relationship between information security and PII protection is appropriately managed, right? And the organization can either apply integrated information security and privacy risk assessments processes or 2 separate ones for information security and the risks related to the processing of PII. So this is how ISO put it together. Okay, so it references to the standard, the 27001 or 27002, but it gives a little bit more detail of the privacy aspects of it. And that's it. So now we're almost to the end of the presentation. I'd like to just to summarize some of the differences and comparisons about NIST privacy versus so I put it here, and the ISO. Okay. So what we can talk about this. So objectives are the same. Okay. So let me put here and then we talk over it. Okay. They are different methodologies, as you see. They handles and cover it in a different way, right? But again, so the objectives are the same. They want to provide specific privacy requirements regarding privacy related things compared with the cybersecurity requirements that they may have. So they want to remember that the intersection between cybersecurity requirements and privacy requirements, the intersection between them, both of them cover this intersection between two of them. Even ISO has its own privacy framework for purely privacy related things. But the ISO 27001 is to talk about the intersection between cybersecurity and privacy. So the objectives are quite the same. They are different methodologies because they deal with that differently. Obviously, NIST follows more the NIST framework for cybersecurity, and the ISO follows the ISO framework for information security management, which is the ISO 27001 and 27002. Also, they have a little bit different approaches. They deal with privacy a little bit differently. NIST follows the structure of the cybersecurity framework, and the ISO 27001 follows obviously the ISO 27001 and 27002, and both tries to be flexible enough and regulation, I would say, agnostic. Okay, not, I know that the ISO tends to be a little bit more closer to the GDPR, but when it was designed, it does not intend to be just map it directly to the GDPR. It helps GDPR because I think it's more preeminent in Europe, but the ISO 27001 can go beyond GDPR and it can map that to any other privacy regulation that you may have. Okay, so that basically the comparison of the two different approaches from the NIST privacy and the ISO 27701, and picking the right framework. So if you want to pick the right framework, I'd like to give you some tips about that. So picking the right framework. So obviously, right, if you're already using the NIST, why not use the NIST framework? It's going to be easier for you. If you're using already ISO 27001 and 27002, obviously, right, you should continue using the ISO because it's going to be easier for you, right? Not necessarily you have to, but it's easier. But you have to take a couple of things in consideration. So first of all is the usage context, right? This is very important. The second one, comfortability level. So if you're more comfortable with NIST, so you look at both of them, which one feels you more comfortable to use? That's very important because at the end of the day, you're going to be the one that's going to lead this and drive this. So you have to be comfortable with that. What about also the learning curve? So the learning curve not only to you, but to your employees and to disseminate that through your organization. The other aspects about the culture, the deployment easiness. If your organization culture is all over, U.S. standards, right? This is easier. If you're more European, right, culture, right? Maybe ISO are going to be easier, right? Also, pertinent laws and regulation to the company. also may help you decide that. And the geography exposition, again, for global or US centric and so on. Okay, I hope this can help you to pick your own, right? And I think that's it. So I think we are at the end, just on time here. I'd like to thank you for your participation. And I don't know, maybe I'm not sure if you have more time for questions. Let me take a look here. Yeah, there is one question here about how to decide between ISO 27001 and or NIST privacy frameworks. I think I just answered that question. And if there is no other questions, I think we're good to go. Again, thank you for your participation, and looking forward to see you in the next session. Take care.